In late January of 2022, a country's visible presence on the internet began to disappear in segments. Mail servers first, then government portals, then entire blocks of IP space going dark. Network monitors saw the failure patterns, but they didn't see an army of attackers, a ransomware note, or a public claim of responsibility. What they saw looked like pressure applied at the right places, at the right time, against infrastructure that was already unusually small and rigid. The central mystery is not that North Korea's internet went down. The mystery is how a disruption at nation-state scale appears to have been driven by a single actor, known only by an alias. No face, no biography, no verified location, only technical traces, a few public statements reported secondhand, and a timeline that can be reconstructed from outages and routing data. This file examines what can be documented, the context, the sequence of events, and what investigators and analysts say happened to North Korea's limited external internet connectivity. It also examines what remains missing, attribution certainty, the exact mechanisms used, and the unanswered question of how far a lone operator can go when a target's infrastructure is brittle. Case background begins with an asymmetry. North Korea has a tightly controlled domestic network and a comparatively small set of routes that connect to the global internet. Unlike most countries, its externally visible internet footprint is narrow, concentrated, and dependent on a small number of upstream connections and providers. That narrow footprint makes the country harder to study from the outside in many ways, but it also creates choke points, limited pathways where disruption can have outsized effect. By 2021 and into early 2022, the broader cyber context was already tense. US and allied agencies had repeatedly attributed theft and intrusion campaigns to North Korean state-linked groups. Those campaigns included cryptocurrency theft, supply chain compromises, and long-running espionage operations, documented by private security firms and government advisories. But the event in this file flips the usual direction. Instead of North Korean operators targeting foreign systems, the disruption hits North Korea's own outward-facing infrastructure. The alleged motive, as later reported by multiple outlets citing interviews, was a personal grievance, a belief that North Korean hackers had targeted the actor and that US agencies did not respond decisively. That motive is reported, not conclusively proven. The actor's identity is not publicly verified, and the known details come largely from investigative reporting and technical correlation. To reconstruct the timeline, investigators start with objective signals, routing announcements, DNS reachability, and observed uptime for servers associated with North Korean institutions. Publicly accessible telemetry from global monitoring platforms can show when networks stop responding, when BGP routes drop, and when name servers fail to resolve. On or around January 26, 2022, multiple researchers reported unusual instability in North Korean connectivity, with repeated outages affecting government and state-linked domains. The following days produced a pattern: services returning briefly, then falling again, suggesting persistent pressure rather than a single accidental failure. By January 30th, and into January 31st, reports described a major loss of availability across North Korean internet services, websites, email, and other externally reachable systems. At the peak of the disruption, some analysts describe the country as effectively offline from the perspective of many external observers, with only sporadic or limited connectivity visible. A key point in the reconstruction is that the outages were not limited to one site or one server. They appeared to impact core connectivity and routing in ways consistent with upstream disruption. The small number of external gateways matters here. If a target has few transit links, and those links are congested or misrouted, the entire external footprint can collapse quickly. During the outage window, researchers watching BGP and reachability data documented that North Korean IP ranges became unreachable from many vantage points. At the same time, some connections appeared to flicker, which is consistent with partial restoration, load shifting, or mitigation attempts upstream. No publicly confirmed technical root cause was announced by North Korea. There was no transparent incident report, no acknowledgement, and no detailed explanation offered to the global internet community. Early speculation included the usual suspects: an internal misconfiguration, a power failure, or a state-directed shutdown. But independent analysts emphasize that the observed behavior resembled a denial of service campaign or targeted interference against critical routing and name infrastructure. The distinction matters. A misconfiguration can drop routes abruptly and then recover cleanly when corrected. Sustained external pressure tends to create waves, congestion, and repeated failures. In reporting that followed, journalists described an actor using an alias, claiming to have executed the disruption as retaliation for prior North Korean cyber activity. The actor's reported approach was not a single exploit. It was a campaign, identifying fragile points, applying pressure, observing results, and escalating until the target's external presence degraded broadly. That is a significant operational detail. It implies patience, iterative testing, and the use of monitoring to confirm impact, features more common in professional operations than casual attacks. What would a campaign like this likely involve, based on what researchers described and what is technically plausible? The first element is reconnaissance. Reconnaissance in this context means mapping visible IP ranges, identifying authoritative name servers, cataloging externally reachable services, and understanding upstream providers and routing dependencies. The second element is selecting pressure points. For a small national footprint, pressure points may include limited transit links, edge routers, or critical DNS and mail infrastructure that many services depend on. The third element is capacity, the ability to generate enough traffic from enough sources to overwhelm links or devices, or to exploit weaknesses in how traffic is filtered. This is where the lone actor claim becomes controversial. Large-scale denial of service campaigns often require botnets, rented infrastructure, amplification methods, or access to compromised systems. But capacity does not always mean owning a botnet. An attacker can chain together rented servers, use reflection or amplification, or take advantage of poorly protected intermediaries. In this case, Details about the exact tooling were not publicly proven. The account presented in reporting suggested a mixture of methods developed over time, not a single off-the-shelf package. The timeline also includes an important precursor. Weeks earlier, in January 2022, North Korea suffered a separate disruption affecting its rail system, reported by multiple outlets. That earlier event was attributed by some reporting to a different actor or operation, and it is not conclusively tied to the internet outages at the end of the month. However, investigators looking at January 2022 see a cluster of disruptions and attempts, which complicates attribution and makes causality harder to establish from the outside. The end-of-month internet outage remains the centerpiece because it was measurable globally, visible through independent monitoring, and unusually broad for such a constrained network footprint. Next is the investigation phase, which in cyber cases splits into two tracks: open source analysis by researchers and closed investigations by governments and service providers. Open source researchers used reachability tests, BGP monitoring, and historical baselines to compare normal routing behavior with the outage period. They looked for signs of route hijacks, accidental withdrawals, or upstream filtering that could explain the disappearance of services. They also checked whether the failures were uniform across the globe or dependent on region, which can indicate where the disruption occurs in the path between networks. In parallel, private threat intelligence firms compared the incident to known North Korean network topology, including how the country's traffic has historically transited through external carriers. Because North Korea's public footprint is small, some analysts argued the outage was more likely to be a saturation or upstream disruption than a complex intrusion into many independent servers. But there was still a critical limitation: the most decisive logs, router telemetry, upstream traffic captures, provider-level mitigation records are not public. Those records exist, if they exist at all, inside carriers, exchange points, and security systems that do not release detailed evidence for geopolitical incidents. Government investigation is even more opaque. If U.S. agencies assessed the event, they did not publish a detailed, declassified technical report attributing it to a specific person or infrastructure. Some reporting described the hackers' claim that earlier intrusions against them were reported to authorities without a meaningful response. That point, government inaction, perceived or real, becomes part of the narrative because it helps explain why a private actor might escalate to direct retaliation. But it is also a point that cannot be fully validated publicly. Complaint records, investigative steps, and internal decisions are typically confidential. To understand escalation, analysts look for operational markers, repetition, refinement, and persistence over days rather than minutes. The reported pattern: services down, briefly up, then down again, suggests the pressure was maintained and adjusted as defenders attempted mitigation. Mitigation for a small national network can be hard. Over-filtering risks cutting off legitimate traffic entirely, while under-filtering leaves links saturated and services unreachable. If upstream providers are involved, mitigation requires coordination, and coordination requires visibility and trust, two things that are limited when the affected party does not engage openly. From a procedural perspective, one of the most notable features is the absence of public communication from the victim network that could clarify whether this was attack, accident, or intentional shutdown. The case then moved into a second phase, attribution by narrative rather than by subpoenaed logs. Journalists reported contact with an individual using an alias, presenting technical details consistent with knowledge of the disruption and claiming responsibility. Those claims were not accompanied by a full public proof package, no raw logs, no independently verifiable end-to-end traffic captures, no complete list of infrastructure used. Instead, the public understanding rests on a triangulation. The outage happened. The shape of the outage suggests external pressure, and an actor came forward to claim it with some supporting context. That leaves room for uncertainty. Multiple actors can exploit the same weak points, and multiple incidents can overlap, especially when a target network is constrained and already monitored closely. There is also the question of what taking down North Korea actually means in technical terms. It does not mean the country's internal networks disappeared. It refers to North Korea's limited set of connections to the global internet and the externally reachable services tied to those links. Even in the best documented accounts, the outage is best described as a significant disruption of external connectivity, not a complete and permanent erasure of network capability. That nuance matters because it affects both the technical interpretation and the policy interpretation. A fragile border can be disrupted without breaching deep internal systems. Investigators also consider whether the event could have been a defensive reaction by North Korea itself, a self-imposed disconnect to stop an intrusion or reduce exposure. Self-disconnects have precedent in other contexts, but here, the repeated pattern and the broader reporting lean toward an externally induced outage rather than a single deliberate shutdown. Still, without internal confirmation, that possibility remains on the table in a strictly evidentiary sense. Another investigative angle is the role of upstream providers and transit paths. If the disruption occurred at or near the upstream edge, it could have been caused by saturation, filtering, or instability triggered by attack traffic. If it occurred deeper inside the network, it would imply compromise of routing equipment or critical services, which generally leaves a different set of artifacts. Public evidence leaned more toward edge disruption because a small number of bottlenecks can make the whole footprint look offline when those bottlenecks fail. But again, public evidence is not provider evidence. The most definitive answer remains locked behind private telemetry and state intelligence. At this point, the case file becomes a study in missed opportunities, less about what a hacker did and more about what the system did not produce afterward. There was no public international incident handling process that produced a shared technical report with agreed-upon indicators, timestamps, and mitigation actions. There was no public legal process tying the outage to specific infrastructure, specific payment trails, or seized servers, as would occur in many high-profile cybercrime cases. And without that process, the public record is left with a gap, a major event, visible symptoms, and a claimed responsibility that is difficult to independently verify in full. This brings the story to the unasked but central question: how does a lone actor sustain pressure against a nation-state network without being rapidly traced or blocked? One answer is that the target's constraints reduce the attacker's workload. Few links and few routes mean fewer places to concentrate force. Another answer is that traditional deterrence models are less effective in the gray zone between criminal enforcement and geopolitical conflict. A private actor operating across jurisdictions using rented infrastructure and obfuscation can be difficult to stop quickly, especially when the victim state does not cooperate with global incident response norms. But these are general explanations, not confirmed details. The case's most important technical specifics remain unverified in public. The file also raises procedural questions about escalation control. If a private actor believes they were targeted by a state-linked group, what mechanisms exist to prevent retaliation from becoming a cycle of uncontrolled disruption? If authorities decline to act or cannot act, does that create a vacuum where retaliation becomes a substitute for policy? And when retaliation succeeds, does it encourage copycats to treat national infrastructure as a legitimate target of personal grievance? Unanswered questions begin with attribution. Was the outage caused by the actor who claimed it, by multiple actors concurrently, or by a combination of attack traffic and internal instability? The public cannot conclusively answer that, because independent verification would require privileged network data and cross-provider correlation that has not been released. Next is capability. If the actor was truly operating alone, what resources were used? Rented servers, compromised systems, amplification techniques, or access to existing botnets? The public record does not include a complete infrastructure map, nor a post-incident seizure list, which would normally anchor such claims to hard evidence. Another gap is duration. Reports describe outages across days, but the precise window varies by measurement method and vantage point, and partial restorations complicate the definition of down. There is also the question of mitigation. Did upstream carriers deploy filters or black holes? Did routing policies change? Did North Korea reroute through alternate links? Those actions would leave traces in operational logs, not necessarily in public monitoring data, and they have not been disclosed in a way that resolves the uncertainty. Finally, there is the motive question. The grievance described in reporting is specific, but without identity and documentation, it remains an account rather than a proven causal chain. Current status is defined by what did not happen publicly after the outage. There has been no widely publicized arrest, indictment, or official attribution naming a suspect for the incident. There has been no formal closure of the event in public records comparable to major cybercrime takedowns, where infrastructure and identities are presented as evidence. Instead, the case persists as a partially documented cyber incident, visible symptoms, expert interpretation, and an alleged claim of responsibility without a complete evidentiary release. North Korea's external internet presence returned, but the event remains a reference point for how disruption can be achieved against a small, centralized national footprint. The long-term implications are procedural as much as technical. If a single actor can apply sustained pressure to a nation-state's external connectivity, even temporarily, then resilience is not just a question of firewalls and malware defenses. It is a question of network architecture, upstream dependencies, and whether a country's connectivity is diversified enough to absorb shocks. It is also a question of governance, how states respond to reported intrusions, how they coordinate with providers, and how quickly they can separate criminal activity from geopolitical escalation. In this file, the reported trigger was government inaction, and the response was private retaliation. That sequence is difficult to reconcile with conventional deterrence theory. The open ending is where the case remains most active, in the unanswered questions that still shape how analysts interpret the event. Was this truly the work of one operator, or was one alias a convenient label for a broader set of capabilities and infrastructure? Did upstream providers see clear attack signatures? And if so, what mitigations were deployed? And why were those details never made public? What thresholds separate activism, retaliation, and cyber war when the target is national connectivity and the actor is not a state? And if this incident can be repeated, what prevents the next disruption from targeting other small national networks with similar choke points? The record ends where it began, with an outage visible on the global map, an alleged alias in the background, and a lack of definitive public closure. Until verifiable evidence is released, logs, infrastructure seizures, or official attribution that can be tested, the hacker who took down North Korea remains a documented event with an unverified author.